Good evening, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us. My name is Mehlaqa Samdani. I am with the Community Alliance for Peace and Justice, an advocacy group that works to transform U.S. policy towards Palestine and Pakistan. I would like to thank our partners, Massachusetts Peace Action and Connecticut Palestine Alliance, for co-sponsoring this event with us. As we gather today, almost 2 years into Israel's genocide in Gaza, we confront a landscape of unimaginable loss. According to conservative estimates, over 67,000 Palestinians have been killed, nearly 2 million displaced, and 80% of Gaza's infrastructure reduced to rubble. Amid this devastation, President Trump recently proposed a 20-point plan, which, as of this moment, both Israel and Hamas, as well as 8 Arab and Muslim countries, have endorsed. Some see the plan as something that could potentially lead to a fragile pause in the violence, even though more than 100 Palestinians have been killed since Trump urged Israel to immediately stop the bombing. At the same time, huge questions remain about the plan's implications for Palestinian rights and liberation, as well as broader stability in the Middle East. Over the next hour, we will delve into these critical questions with two of the foremost experts on international relations and Middle East geopolitics, Dr. Trita Parsi and Dr. John Mearsheimer. Trita is founder and executive vice president of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, a renowned scholar on Iran-US relations and author of acclaimed books like Treacherous Alliance and Losing an Enemy. We also have with us Dr. John Mearsheimer, who is the R. Wendell Harrison Distinguished Service Professor at the University of Chicago and co-author of the groundbreaking The Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy. He is also a leading voice in realist international relations theory. Thank you both so much for joining us. It is such an honor to have you both.
Thank you.
Before we begin, just a quick word about the format. For the first 40 minutes or so, I'm going to ask our speakers a series of questions, after which we will open the discussion for an audience Q&A. Please submit your questions in the Q&A function, and we'll get to as many as possible. So without further ado, Trita, let me turn to you first. So, 2 years after Israel's genocide, it looks like Trump's 20-point plan offers a potential pause to the catastrophic conditions in Gaza. What is your assessment of this plan? How viable is it? And what do you think it means for Palestinian self-determination?
Thank you, Malak. It's great to be back with you, and always a pleasure to be on together with John. Let me say this about this plan. I think there is a single reason as to why there is even a slight degree of optimism or hope around it, and that is simply because of the fact that for several months now, the Trump administration has essentially just followed Israel's lead. And rather surprisingly to a lot of nations, suddenly the administration came out with a plan of their own and took the initiative. And not only an initiative to get a ceasefire, but this time around to actually end the war altogether. At least that's the rhetorical top line of all of this. That has been welcomed, not because of the necessary details of the proposal, but precisely because the Trump administration has kind of gotten out of the stage of just following the lead of Netanyahu. But when it comes to the details and the actual substance of the proposal, it's a different matter. Now, why did the administration then, out of the blue, essentially come out with this proposal? I think there's two key factors. One is the Saudi-French initiative at the UN, which culminated in the New York Declaration that was adopted back in September, and the large number of states that came out and recognized Palestine. Obviously, a very symbolic move, but one that nevertheless the administration tried to stop. They tried to sabotage the conference, and they could not, and it yielded a tremendous amount of momentum internationally. But the bigger, more important factor is the overreach that the Israelis committed by attacking Qatar, Doha. That really backfired, mainly because, of course, they also failed in what they sought to achieve. Had they succeeded, I think we have to be honest that perhaps Trump's reaction would have been different, but they failed. And this is obviously something that have sent shockwaves through the region. It has shown that not only is the United States unwilling to restrain Israel when it comes to its conduct in Lebanon, in the West Bank, in Syria, in Gaza, towards Iran, but now all and Yemen, but now also even when Israel chooses to target non-NATO allies of the United States. Now, this led to a situation inside of the White House in which I think the balance shifted in favor of those who actually wanted to put more pressure on Israel. And this then culminated in this effort. That's part of the reason why you see a lot of countries essentially welcoming the effort, not necessarily the substance. When it comes to the substance, there is a tremendous amount to be desired because at the end of the day, particularly mindful of the changes to the proposal that the Israelis have injected, this is not a proposal that, based just on the substance, actually warrants a tremendous amount of optimism.
Sure. And it's interesting that you say that, Trita. I mean, I'm going to sort of ask my next question to Professor Mearsheimer because, there some analysts actually have suggested since this plan came out that this plan was really Netanyahu's plan that was then repackaged as an American initiative for broader appeal and to make it more palatable. I know, Trita, that you feel like this is more of, an American-driven plan. But Professor Mearsheimer, what do you think are Israel's ultimate goals in Gaza and the wider region? And how does this plan enable or curb Israel's ambitions?
Well, I've long believed that despite all the talk, that the principal goal is to defeat Hamas militarily and get back the hostages, that the real goal is to ethnically cleanse Gaza. It's to drive out all of the Palestinians. And what happened here is that when the war broke out on October 7th, the Israelis saw this as a wonderful opportunity to cleanse Gaza. You want to remember that the two big cleansing operations, 1948 and 1967, took place in the midst of a war. So here we have a war, and the Israelis see a great opportunity to cleanse. And what they think they can do is they can punish the Palestinians, mainly with an air campaign, but also by sending in ground forces, kill lots of Palestinians. And in effect, what will happen is they will flee, and they will flee maybe into Jordan, maybe into Egypt. But they will leave Gaza because they don't want to stay in Gaza and be murdered. But the fact is, despite the fact that the Israelis have murdered, I would estimate over 100,000 have died already. And in terms of indirect deaths, the number will be much larger
Mhm.
moving forward. But anyway, despite all that murder and mayhem that the Israelis have created, the Palestinians have not left. And very importantly, there's no country, especially Egypt or Jordan, that will take them in.
Mhm.
So the Israelis are in a situation where they're basically failing to achieve what is their principal goal. And if you look carefully at the plan that President Trump put forward, it is filled with flaws. It looks like a neo-colonial plan. That's a word I don't use very often, but when you look at that plan, it looks like neo-colonialism on steroids. But anyway, be that as it may, the fact is that the plan basically says that the Palestinians aren't going anywhere. And in fact, there's one clause in the plan that says if the Palestinians leave, they can come back. Well, from Netanyahu's point of view and from a large chunk of Israelis' point of view, this is a disaster. They have not gotten rid of the Palestinians. They have failed. And in the process, the damage that has been done to Israel's international standing, to its reputation, not simply in the short term, but in the long term, has been enormous. So again, you see ethnically cleansing Gaza is their principal goal, and they failed. Now, you also ask a bigger question, which is what are their broader goals in the region? Well, first of all, they're interested in a greater Israel. They're interested in Lebensraum. And greater Israel up to now has mainly involved 1967, pre-1967 Israel plus Gaza plus the West Bank. That's greater Israel. Uh, but the fact is, they want more territory. I believe they want southern Lebanon up to the Litani River. I believe they want southern Damascus. I believe they want parts of the Sinai. And I wouldn't be surprised if they want parts of the East Bank, which now belong to Jordan. They have a voracious appetite for territory. They want a greater Israel that covers a great deal of real estate in the region. Second point you want to keep in mind, and this dovetails with what I said about Gaza, is they want it to be Palestinian free. They not only want to drive the Palestinians out of Gaza, they want to drive the Palestinians out of the West Bank. And if you look at what they've been doing since October 7th of 2023, they have been trying to push the Palestinians out of the West Bank as well, but they have failed. So they want a Palestinian-free greater Israel. Furthermore, you have to think about what they want with regard to their neighbors. They want weak neighbors. They want to break their neighbors apart. They want to do to Iran what they did in Syria. It's very important to understand that the nuclear issue is of central importance to the Israelis in Iran, but they have broader goals, which is to wreck Iran, turn it into a series of small states. And then states that they don't break apart, like Egypt and Jordan, they want them to be economically dependent on Uncle Sam so that Uncle Sam has huge coercive leverage over them. So they're thinking seriously about how to deal with all their neighbors and make sure that they're weak and don't pose any kind of threat to Israel. And then their final goal is to make sure that they have the United States of America wrapped around their little finger. They want to be in a situation where they can basically tell the United States what to do. They want a situation where the United States supports Israel unconditionally. So I think those are the principal goals. And I think when you think about what those goals are, you quickly come to understand that the Israelis are going to be inflicting murder and mayhem on the region for a long time to come.
Sure. And thank you for that sobering analysis, Professor Mearsheimer. Well, Trita, given that sort of analysis that Professor Mearsheimer has laid out, this naturally raises questions about how regional actors are now responding to these developments. We all know that over the past 2 years, Israel has attacked 7 regional countries, right? So why is it then that 8 Arab and Muslim states were so quick to endorse Trump's 20-point plan, despite its lack of clear guarantees for Palestinian self-determination, but then also despite the lack of U.S. security guarantees to some of these countries as well, given the attack on Qatar and then Iran. So what are the strategic calculations behind the support of these regional and Muslim countries? And do you also see this plan as a step towards normalization with Israel? Does that make sense in the wider analysis?
Thanks so much. Let me first say, at the center of the calculation of the regional states is not the plight of the Palestinians. They're looking out for their own interest. They are not indifferent to what is happening to the Palestinians. They have a public opinion at home that they have to respond to. But it is not at the center of this. So if they manage to get some sort of an arrangement that helps them, even at the expense of the Palestinians, history teaches us that that is the route that they will go. Now, of course, under the current circumstances, from their viewpoint, they will probably ferociously argue that if they manage to get to an agreement that puts an end to the genocide, then they have done the Palestinians a huge favor, even if that same agreement sells out their broader aspirations for statehood. But so I think first we have to be very clear about that. Secondly, I would say that going back to what I said earlier on, they were in a position in which they saw that US's foreign policy under Trump, at least during the last couple of months, it wasn't necessarily the case during the first month of his second term, has just completely become deferential to Netanyahu. And then if he is taking a step in the direction of some sort of an arrangement that puts an end to the war, despite all of these other flaws that John correctly pointed out is entailed in the version of the agreement we see now, not the version that the Arabs actually signed on to, then that nevertheless is something that they see as a positive step in the right direction. They want to encourage it, but also with the calculation that they think, probably correctly, that ultimately the Israelis will undermine that plan because of their own internal politics, because of Ben-Gvir and Smotrich in the government, because of the factors that John pointed out. So it's better for them to position themselves as being welcoming of this arrangement and let Netanyahu be the bad guy who causes it to fail and causes it to burn his cards and his standing with Trump rather than the Arab side or the other countries in the Middle East doing so. But you're quite right. On the surface, when you look at this is falling way short, at least the version that Netanyahu amended, way short of what many of these states have said that they wanted to see.
Right. So you do believe that even if Palestinian statehood is not guaranteed, that I mean, what about normalization? Do you think this might lead to that? Will Saudi Arabia think that just by stopping the genocide, it has done enough to then be able to normalize relations with Israel?
I think the very idea of normalization has ended up becoming something very different from what it was prior to October 7th. Obviously, the administration is going to continue to talk about this. This is part of their idea, the Abraham Accords, that they think is going to get Trump some sort of a peace prize at some point. But in the region, we've already seen it, that the US's investment in this has been quite foolish. I was on a panel with a senior Biden official just a couple of weeks ago, and we talked about this, and it was very clear. She pointed out that after October 7th, the Saudis started to lose interest in it because the Israelis completely lost interest in normalization. The only party that was still investing in it was actually the United States, quite foolishly. And now the Trump administration may repeat this, but calculations in the region have changed dramatically. Uh, the Abraham Accords has an extremely negative name. It is seen as part of the reason as to why this violence erupted again. And many of us called it out at the time, pointing out that if you are shoving the Palestinian issue under the rug, then you have proven that the negotiated path for the Palestinians towards statehood is not something that the West will honor. That will leave the Palestinians only with the option of returning to some variation of violence at some point. Exactly how it would happen, when it would happen, obviously was impossible to tell. But the fact that it would go in that direction was clear to a lot of people.
Sure. Professor Mearsheimer, let me turn to you. I mean, sort of regarding the shift in the Gulf states' threat perceptions, right? Before October 7, 2023, Gulf states primarily viewed Iran as the regional threat. But with Israel's Doha airstrike and the June war with Iran, coupled with a muted US response, have Gulf states begun to see Israel as the greater danger here? And with the recent Saudi-Pakistan Mutual Defense Pact, which signals, alternative alliances, do you foresee many more such pacts emerging? And how might they reshape the Middle East security architecture?
Well, I think the Gulf states, and this includes Saudi Arabia, had serious reservations about relying on the United States before October 7th. The United States has been behaving in wild and crazy ways for quite a while now, and countries all around the world have had serious reservations about how reliable the United States is as an ally. You want to remember, we did have a first term with President Trump, which was from 2017 to 2021. So countries are well aware of how mercurial he can be. And then, of course, Joe Biden was president. And Joe Biden, in my opinion, on the foreign policy front, was a terrible president. And if you were another country, whether you were in Europe or in the Gulf, there was good reason to worry about the reliability of the United States.
Mhm.
I think just to focus on the Saudis, because they're a really good example, I think they wanted an Abraham Accord as a way of tightening their security relationship with the United States. And I think they thought that they could jump into bed not only with the United States, but the Israelis as well. and that would go a long way towards alleviating their security fears. But then October 7th happened, and as Trita described things, the United States has bandwagoned with Israel, supported it hook, line, and sinker. And of course, the Israelis are executing a genocide. They're attacking countries all over the region, including Qatar. And this just raises all sorts of questions about the reliability of the United States, number one. And number two, how do you deal with this rogue state called Israel? Uh, and of course, the end result is you saw that the Saudis have formed a military alliance with the Pakistanis. And as best I can tell from the rhetoric, the Pakistanis are putting their nuclear umbrella over Saudi Arabia. Now, whether they would ever use nuclear weapons to defend Saudi Arabia is another matter. But the mere fact that people are talking like that just tells you how nervous the Saudis are. And then the final point I would make is that you have to think about sort of where we're headed in the future in terms of the alliance arrangements in the greater Middle East. And the fact is that the Chinese are building a blue water navy, and they're interested in projecting power, not just military power, but diplomatic and economic power into the Middle East. And the Saudis, I am sure, will spend a lot of time thinking about whether to have a tight relationship with the Chinese and not worry so much about the Americans. And if you're the Saudis, maybe the Chinese and the Pakistanis look like a pair of good allies, because you want to remember in the spring of this year, when India and Pakistan got into a fight, the Chinese backed the Pakistanis. The Chinese and the Pakistanis are, I would say, close allies. And I believe, by the way, they'll become closer allies with the passage of time. So you can imagine a situation, I'm not saying this is going to happen, where the Pakistanis and the Chinese provide a lot of Saudi Arabia's security. And this would be a fundamentally different situation that we saw in the past, because Uncle Sam provided a security umbrella for Saudi Arabia. But the Saudis, and I'm sure many other countries in the region, have really begun to wonder whether that makes sense.
That's very interesting that you raised the China point, because, I was wondering whether the Saudi-Pakistan Mutual Defense Pact is also a very clear signal to China, given the Pakistan-China relationship. And, during the May war between India and Pakistan, a lot of people felt that it was, yes, Pakistan Air Force's heft, but also Chinese equipment that made it possible for Pakistan to dominate the skies at that point. And so if this mutual defense pact is really also a signal to sort of come under China's security architecture as well. So
Yes, if I can make just sort of one
sure.
additional point, building on what you said. Uh, Obviously, the Americans and the Israelis have their gun sights on Iran, as Trita knows better than I do.
Yes.
And they have weakened Iran somewhat. And furthermore, they've put Iran in a situation where it's mainly interested in defending itself against these two highly aggressive states.
Mhm.
That makes Iran much less of a threat to Saudi Arabia and other states in the region. And therefore, it allows those states to think about dealing with the Pakistanis and the Chinese and distance themselves from the Americans in ways that was not the case in the past.
That's interesting. That's interesting. Thank you for that, Professor Mearsheimer. So, Trita, speaking
Could
about
I add, could I add
yes,
a couple of points
please
to
go
all this?
ahead. Yes.
Your China point is very important here, but I think it is partly because this is still a way for the Saudis to essentially signal to the United States that if it doesn't get stronger, guarantees from the United States, even though those guarantees clearly do not have much value, but nevertheless, that Saudi Arabia has options. Going towards Pakistan is a way of signaling that they're moving in the direction of China, mindful of the fact, as you pointed out, that the Pakistanis do have a lot of Chinese weaponry. So I think this was a signal to the United States. I'm not so sure that the Pakistanis really are going to go to war with Israel, for instance, if Israel attacks Saudi Arabia. It is also to a certain extent potentially a signal to Iran, because the region is now very nervous that the Israelis are going to attack Iran again, and that the Trump administration may very well end up getting involved in a more offensive and prolonged way than it did in the 12-day war, in which the US involvement was primarily in helping the Israelis with their defenses, and then that one attack on the nuclear facilities. In that situation, it is much, much more likely that the Iranians will have their backs completely against the wall, and as a result, will attack US bases. So far, we have seen how they have gone out of their way to avoid a direct confrontation with the United States, to the point that there's a lot of criticism inside of Iran that they have completely lost any deterrence potential because they keep on allowing their red lines to get crossed. If we get to that situation, then the question is, what bases would the Iranians hit in the region? The United States has already vacated a lot of its bases in the region, not in the sense that they've left them all together, but a lot of the equipment and the personnel are out. There's a few bases left in Iraq, in Syria, and in Saudi Arabia. So this umbrella may also be a way for the Saudis to signal to the Iranians, we know you're in a very bad situation. We know that in that scenario, you will likely try to target wherever you can get a hold of Americans to strike back at. But you can't do it in our territory because we now have this agreement with Pakistan. And remember, last year, the Iranians did hit Pakistan, Baluchi separatists that were operating out of Pakistan. And the Pakistanis responded rather quickly by hitting Iran on some target that I think the two sides have come to an agreement would be the exchange of fire. So I'm not saying this is a certainty, but I'm saying that given where things are going, the Saudis have to be very concerned that we are much closer towards a war that will involve their territory. And as much as they would love for the United States not to do this, they still have to have a plan B.
Sure, that's a very interesting point. So yes, let's talk a little bit more about Iran, Trita. With Iran's axis of resistance, Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis significantly weakened, where does Iran fit into these emerging regional dynamics, right? With all of these pacts that are emerging, does it view these growing alliances as a threat or an opportunity for integration? Because I remember as soon as this pact between Saudi Arabia and Pakistan was signed, I think at the UN General Assembly, the president of Iran, made some very favorable remarks about it. So that's one part of the question. And then, given Israel's recent actions, and as you just alluded to, how likely is another attack on Iran? And what diplomatic off-ramps remain to prevent further escalation?
Okay, very good. Let me start off with your second question first. I am of the view that there's a very high likelihood that the Israelis will strike again, and they will do so most likely before end of December. And I'll explain why. The Israelis had three objectives with their attack on Iran. Only one of them was successful. That was the objective of finally getting the United States into a direct military confrontation with Iran. The Israelis had pushed for this for more than 25 years. Netanyahu, more than any other Israeli prime minister. Every American president had said no, including Trump during his first term. Now they finally got a yes. But it wasn't the yes they had hoped for. They had hoped that the United States would be fully involved and take out as much of Iran's military capabilities as possible. Instead, it was just a one-off. Nevertheless, I would put it in the success category. The two other objectives were failures. First was to decapitate the Iranian regime. Despite some significant successes they had in the first 24 hours of the war, in which they completely took the Iranians by surprise, killed a large number of its top senior military officials, as well as civilian nuclear scientists and all of their families. The Iranians, within 18 hours, replaced all of those individuals and started shooting missiles back at Israel. So and beyond that, the Israelis had hoped that the attack would have caused mayhem on the streets of Iran, people rising up against the current government, given its lack of popularity. Instead, the opposite happened. A massive wave of nationalism took place, and the distance between Iran's government and Iran's society started to bridge, whether that's a long-term thing or just a temporary phenomenon remains to be seen. This took the Israelis by surprise, and I'll have to say, I think it took the Iranian government by surprise as well to see that wave of nationalism, given all of the difficulties that the country is faced with internally. The third objective goes to what John talked about earlier on, and that is essentially trying to reduce Iran to the next Syria, the next Lebanon, a country that Israel can strike with impunity, at will, without American involvement. It's a crucial differentiation. Israel has the ability to do so with Lebanon and Syria, obviously with Gaza and the West Bank. It does not have the ability to do so with Iran. I don't think they thought that they could achieve that objective in the first round of this war. I do think, however, that they thought that they would be able to do so. They would be able to get further towards that objective than what they did. Now, having started this war, however, the Israelis, from their standpoint, cannot allow the Iranians enough time to be able to rebuild their air defense systems, perhaps get better ones from the Chinese, perhaps buy Russian jets, which apparently is now in the making, to be able to root out the Mossad presence inside of the country, which clearly was extensive. The more time passes, the better the Iranians likely will be equipped for a second round. And then you have the political window, which is that once you enter the midterm elections in the United States, it's not prohibitive, but it does make the calculations much more complicated and much more difficult to navigate matters with Trump. Because at the end of the day, they need America's approval and assistance in that war. This is why I think there's a high likelihood that there will be another war before December. The one factor I think that may potentially change it is the manner in which the Israeli overreach by attacking Doha has really cost them with the White House. Whether that is sufficiently extensive to actually rein them in vis-a-vis Iran remains to be seen. But to your first question, if you could just remind me what it was.
Of course. I mean, how is Iran perceiving these?
Yes, how is Iran figuring into all of this? So Iran is in this dilemma, which is that when it's powerful, it is perceived as a threat by many of its neighbors. When it has lost power, it's considered more or less irrelevant. I'm not saying that it's entirely irrelevant, but bottom line is they do want to take advantage of the integration that now is taking place because the countries of the region are increasingly making their calculations based on the idea that the United States is not going to be involved in the military affairs of the region actively in terms of defending them. Clearly, if you still believe in an American security umbrella, I wish you the best. But bottom line is, most of them do not. That doesn't mean that they're abandoning it. It means that on the surface, they will continue to pretend to honor it just as much as the United States is pretending to honor it.
Mm-hmm.
Underneath the surface, they're going to be diversifying their baskets by investing in all kinds of different weapon systems, potential alliances, etc. And I think the Pakistan-Saudi thing is just the first example of what we will see. But you will not have a situation in which any of these countries will openly go out and say, we are no longer relying on the United States, or, we're giving up that alliance. They cannot afford to do so. This is going to be a game of mutual pretense for the next couple of years.
Interesting.
Can I ask Trita a question?
Please do, yes.
One could make an argument that the Israelis and the Americans will not attack for two reasons that you did not mention. One is that Iran really pounded the Israelis the last time. The Israelis basically ran out of, or were running out of, air defense systems, and there are limits to what the United States has for purposes of helping them. Furthermore, the Iranians learned as the ballistic missile campaign / cruise missile campaign went on. They got much smarter. All militaries go through a learning process when they get into a war, and the Iranians are no exception. So by the end, they were pretty sophisticated at finding the holes in the Israeli air defenses and getting the missiles through. The next time, with all that experience and all those missiles they have, they're going to really pound Israel. And Israel is a small country. The idea that Israel is going to pound Iran and get off scot-free, that's not going to happen. So that's point one. Point two is, a lot of people say that one of the reasons the Americans shut the war down after 12 days was they had an inkling that the Iranians were going to shut down the Gulf. the Straits of Hormuz, and the economic consequences of that, especially given the state of the international economy, would have been disastrous, is probably not too strong a word. So if I were the Iranians, I'd say to both the Americans and the Israelis, you want to play hardball, okay, but you want to understand I'm going to play hardball too. And we're going to do everything we can to pound Israel, number one. And number two, we're going to shut down the Straits of Hormuz and do great damage to the international economy. The idea that you're going to wreck the Iranian economy and pay no price, forget that. We're going to make everybody pay. So you better not attack. It would just seem to me, Trita, I mean, if I had to bet, I'd bet you're right that the Israelis and the Americans, but mainly the Israelis, will attack. But I think there is a quite powerful case against that. And I'm just curious what you think.
Oh, John, I completely agree with you. I think there's a very powerful case, particularly from an American national interest standpoint, that this is absolutely foolish. I mean, you mentioned that the Israelis were running out of Arrow 3 interceptors. The United States consumed 25% of its THAAD interceptors over the course of 12 days in a region that 3 administrations in a row have said is no longer vital to U.S. interest. So clearly, from a standpoint of the United States, yes, I agree with you 100%. It doesn't make any sense. Now, from the Israeli standpoint, everything you said in your first part of the question, all of the abilities of the Iranians to strike Israel, and let me just give a couple of examples of it. We saw how, exactly as you said, over the course of the war, the Iranians actually started shooting less and less missiles. And the public narrative was, oh, the Iranians are taking huge hits, the Israelis are taking out their launchers, etc. And to a certain extent, that was true. The Iranians were taking hits, some of the launchers were taken out. But the real story is that they were getting through more and more missiles. If I'm not mistaken, on the last day, they only shot 30 missiles, 19 of them got through.
Yeah.
And they were also getting much better at using cyber warfare at the exact moments that the missiles either were being launched or when they were reaching Israel, because you only needed to get the Israeli systems off for 2 or 3 seconds in order to make sure that you created those gaps. So without a doubt, they learned quite a lot. But this is precisely why the Israelis are going to attack rather than the opposite. Israel does not tolerate that there is any country in the region that actually has the ability to deter Israel, that is infringing on what they believe is the necessity of their complete maneuverability in the region. I mean, the Israelis have a security doctrine in which they have to have total security. And as a result, everyone else have to have total insecurity. So when you have a state like Iran that have shown its ability to be able to hurt Israel, that is all the more reason for the Israelis to go in and try to make sure that they take it out. Now, of course, you're right. It's going to be much more costly than what they thought. They needed that ceasefire because they were taking more and more hits. And they particularly needed the ceasefire because it became clear that the US was no longer going to be in the war. Had Trump decided to be fully engaged in the war, I think the Israelis would have accepted taking and absorbing even more hits, as long as they knew that America's firepower was also a factor in the war, and that was really taking out a lot of what the Iranians have. But since Trump decided not to do so, I think the cost-benefit analysis for the Israelis changed. But if you're sitting in Israel with their calculations, the fact that there is a state that has that capability, I think makes it all the more unacceptable for them, given the fact that they want to have that complete dominance. Now, as to your second question, you're absolutely right. There were indications that the Iranians were going to try to shut it down. When the US was modeling this 20 or so years ago, it was all about how the Iranians would be using mines, etc. Today, it's very different. The Houthis closed down the Red Sea essentially by just firing missiles. They don't even have to hit the ships. They just need to fire the missiles. It's enough to make sure that no one wants to go through the straits, that the insurance cost becomes prohibitive. So the Iranians clearly have that ability to do so, and it would be devastating for the world economy. But it would probably also cost a lot for Iran with its relations with Russia and particularly with China. So this is not an option that I think the Iranians easily will go towards because it will be costly for them as well. But it is something that the US absolutely should take into account. And I think the mistake that the Trump administration has committed, and I think Trump himself essentially believed that he stopped the war by taking this action. And to a certain extent, on a tactical level, he has a point. But I think it would nevertheless would have been better if he never given a green light to the Israelis in the first place. Because by allowing that to happen, he's now increasingly in a situation in which the Israelis determine much more of the factors that are going into his decision making, and they're essentially shaping his options for him to their liking than otherwise would have been the case. He has to have a much starker break with them in order to be able to retain that agency that he had prior to giving the Israelis this green light.
But Trita, I mean, the 12-day war between Iran and Israel, that stopped because the US shut it down, right? And so if there was so much reluctance then, the loss of their THAAD interceptors, all of that, I mean, why would the US now agree to a much more prolonged war against Iran?
I think we have to be a bit careful. I mean, John and I are both realists. He's much more of a pure realist than I am, probably. And it's at the basis of it that states are rational actors. And I think living in Washington, it's very, very difficult to fully reconcile with that element of realism. I don't see that being, if this was the case, we wouldn't have gone into this war in the first place. And we saw that Trump was moving in a different direction. Something happened in May. He completely shifted. And there is, of course, a fear that because of a variety of political pressures, etc., this once again will be the case. Let me also throw in another factor. Precisely because the Iranians know that the Israeli objective is to subjugate Iran into complete Israeli domination and turn it into the next Lebanon or Syria, the Iranians are likely to strike much harder and faster in the early stages of the next war than they did in the first 12-day war. The Iranians were actually playing the long game. They were hoarding a lot of their missiles, not knowing how long this war was going to be, and they wanted to see if they could have the advantage of being able to tolerate the war longer than the Israeli public would. Now, I think in the next round, they're going to try to strike Israel as hard as possible, as early as possible, to dispel the Israelis from any notion that Iran can be turned into the next Syria or Lebanon. That likely means high casualty events inside of Israel. And that is going to massively increase the pressure on the United States to get involved in the war, even though it makes no strategic sense for the US to do so.
I think, though, what you're saying, Trita, is that both the United States and Israel will behave irrationally because the story you're telling, right, is that it doesn't make sense for either Israel or the United States to start this war. And that was the point that I was trying to get at. This just doesn't make good strategic sense. What's the target set this time if they attack Iran again? They hit the nuclear sites the first time. You remember on June 22nd, Trump struck against Iran, but you can't have another one-off attack like that because those targets have purportedly been destroyed. So what is the American going to do? Americans going to do? Get into a strategic bombing campaign against Iran over the long term that threatens Iran's survival and puts Iran in a position where it's desperate and therefore it does shut down the straits and therefore it does turn the dogs loose on Israel? It just kind of doesn't make sense. But again, I agree with you, they'll do it. But I think what we're saying here, I think if you look at a lot of what Israel has been doing, it does not make strategic sense. The Israelis basically take their six-shooter out every day and blow each foot off. It's really quite remarkable how foolish, from a strategic point of view, their behavior is. And I think that dovetails with your argument as to why they'll do it.
Yeah, John, I agree with you. I find this to be foolish. Let me add something to what you said, but also try to see if I can explain a little bit how I think that they view the situation. At the end of the day, going back to what you yourself said earlier on in this conversation, the Israelis want to make sure that they turn Iran into six smaller countries, collapse the regime, that they keep all of their neighbors weak, etc. Well, that objective requires a war that will be costly to Israel, but precisely because the Iranians may go after the Strait of Hormuz, that is how you get the United States into the war. And what the United States can do in terms of cutting Iran down in size compared to what the Israelis can do, the question is, the answer is obvious. The US can do so much more. If that then means that it will cost Israel a lot in terms of taking a lot of hits, etc., that currently seems to be something that the Israelis are willing to accept. I mean, just take a look at the manner in which they're even embracing the international isolation that they are now subjected to. Israel is on a straight path towards permanent pariahhood because of its conduct, because of this genocide. And it's shocking, mindful of the fact that for such a long time, the Israelis were pointing to their political and economic integration into the world as a sign of their success. They had been accepted. Despite the fact that the Palestinian conflict had not been resolved, they had been accepted. Now, instead, as all of the delegations more or less walk out of the General Assembly when Netanyahu is speaking, when they're risking to be kicked out of the World Cup and the music Eurovision festival in Europe, instead, Netanyahu comes out and says that Israel is going to be super Sparta. The absolute opposite of what he had sought earlier on. Instead of embracing integration and acceptance, they're now embracing pariahhood.
But I want to point out, Trita, that you said before, quite correctly, that the Israelis, when they bombed Iran, drove the population and the government closer together. Nationalism, patriotism came into play. And as you well know, the historical record on this issue is clear-cut. Anytime you bomb a country and you start killing people, the people come together and the people in the government come together. So if you're telling me that the Israelis are now committed to breaking Iran apart, and they're going to do that with air power by punishing the civilian population in Iran, that contradicts what happened the last time they bombed the civilian population. It contradicts everything we know from the historical record. And it guarantees that, if anything, at the end of that bombing campaign, Iran will be more cohesive than ever, and the Israelis will be farther away from their goal of breaking that country apart like Syria and Lebanon.
Again, I agree with you. I think what they're doing is foolish. It's a miscalculation. What I think is they didn't hit it hard enough. They did not manage to break down the command and control. They believe if they manage to destroy the state central control, they will get various provinces with high levels of ethnic minorities, some of them having sectarian or cessationist tendencies, to be able to find opportunities to be able to go in that direction, which probably will be combined with a funneling of weapons into those areas. So this is something the Iranians were very, very cautious about. They were constantly looking at the Kurdish region as well as the Azeri region, fearing that the Israelis would try to do something with their bombing campaign there to cause the central state to lose control over those regions, and then it would have a centrifugal effect of things that they no longer could control. So I think the Israeli calculation is the reason why they failed is because they didn't bomb enough, because they didn't go far enough, and they're going to try it again. I think they're wrong, and I think you are absolutely right that nationalism is a force that is to really be reckoned with. Again, this is not a terribly popular regime, but at the end of the day, when they were attacked, it is not about the popularity of the regime or anything like that that mattered. It was the fact that there was a foreign enemy that was using diplomacy as a guise to actually attack. And I think this is part of the reason why the population's reaction ended up being so ferocious, because this happened 2 days before new scheduled talks, at a moment where the Iranian public clearly saw the Iranian government had gone further than ever before in showing openness for compromises, including compromises that it never agreed to with the Obama administration or the Biden administration in the JCPOA, such as welcoming American companies into the Iranian market. So at the moment when the Iranians were the most flexible in the midst of those talks, that's when the Israelis chose to strike.
Sure. I even don't want to ask any more questions because just the back and forth between you two is just incredibly informative. And so, but I do have one last question to ask Professor Mearsheimer, and then we'll open it up to audience Q&A. And perhaps briefly, Professor Mearsheimer, we've been talking about the Israel-US relation, and you've long argued that unconditional U.S. support enables Israel's actions in Gaza and beyond. However, within the U.S., over the past couple of years, we have seen this significant popular shift occur across the political spectrum. According to a very recent poll by the IMEU, 71% of Democratic voters said that they will vote for a candidate in 2028 who voted to withhold weapons to Israel. 27 senators recently voted to block sending arms to Israel. And we see that there's increasing criticism against U.S. support of Israel among leading MAGA voices like Tucker Carlson and others. Could these domestic shifts, coupled with strategic divergences, finally push the U.S. to restrain Israel? Or do you believe that the Israeli lobby's grip remains unyielding?
When I was young, the lobby and Israel had a firm grip on the public discourse in the United States. It was very pro-Israel. The Arabs were the bad guys, the Israelis were the good guys. And obviously, the lobby and Israel had a firm grip on American policy. So you have to distinguish between the policy and the discourse.
Mhm.
I would argue that over the past, 10, 15 years, since Steve Walton and I wrote our article and then our book, to my amazement, the discourse on Israel has radically changed, as you described it. And I could even embellish on that. It's really quite shocking, the extent to which the discourse has changed. The policy, however, has not changed at all.
Mm.
The big question moving forward is, given that the discourse is likely to deteriorate further from the lobby's point of view, uh, does that mean you're going to get a change in policy? I think that you will eventually get a change in policy. It will have an effect. But the question is, what does the word eventually mean? And I'm sad to say, for one of the few times in my life, I do not have a clear answer to a question of great importance. So I don't know when policy will actually change. But there's no question the discourse is going to have an effect on policy at some point.
Great. Well, thank you so much for that. Not very optimistic sort of endpoint there, but I think we're now going to open it up to audience Q&A. Our CAPJ's board member, Roxanne Bruno, is here to help me field some of those questions, and I hope we can get to as many as possible. So Roxanne, would you like to take the first question?
Yes, and I would like to say thank you both very, very much, because simply in your dialogue together, you have addressed and answered many of the questions already, which is amazing. And it's difficult to choose from among what's left, but the overarching themes, and Dr. Parsi, I think we'll ask this one of you. There is a lot of interest around Russia, which we haven't touched on very deeply, and China. Specifically, a question about why Russia is hesitant to provide more weapons to Iran. And just me thinking about it, I think, well, they are engaged in a protracted war at the moment, and so they may not be able to support Iran more than they already are. But that is one question people are asking is, why is not Russia, why didn't they step in to sort of bolster Iran? And might they?
Thank you. And I think John actually knows more about Russia than I do. But let me just say this. From the Iranian standpoint, there was a disappointment. They were hoping for more support from Russia. I don't think they had the same expectation of the Chinese. At the end of the day, the Chinese have not signed any strategic arrangements that have any military dimension. The Iranians and the Russians do have an agreement, but it's not an agreement that obligates them to defend each other. Now, of course, Russia has its own challenges. It is engaged in a war, and it has some limitations. But I think we should also not forget that just because the Russians have a strong relationship with Iran does not mean that they do not have a very strong relationship with Israel. In fact, today, Netanyahu and Putin had a lengthy call. The Russians have tried to make sure that they have a very deep relationship with Israel. You have a very large number of Russian-speaking Israelis that all migrated to Israel after 1991. So for the Israelis, it is important not to end up in a scenario in which they antagonize the Israelis too much. Now, they can provide certain degrees of support, but I find it very unlikely that they're going to go into this and provide Iran with some sort of a help that would be decisive in that war.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much. So the next question is for Professor Mearsheimer, and that is again about China. And also, Professor Mearsheimer, if you'd like to add on to what Trita said about Russia's role, please go ahead and do that. But let me also ask this question, and that is about China's influence in the Gaza genocide. Why doesn't China play an influential role in the Gaza conflict and take a stand against it? Won't it magnify its soft image perceptions around the world? What are the strategic reasons behind Chinese inaction in the Gaza conflict?
With regard to Trita's answer, there are some people, I would note, Trita, who argue that the Russians were willing to help the Iranians, and the Iranians were not that interested in assistance from them. The argument is that these are two countries that have historically had somewhat antagonistic and sometimes very antagonistic relations. And the Iranians view themselves as operating in a self-help world. And they were not that interested in Russian assistance. And the argument is that since the 12-day war, they've changed their view, and now the Russians are helping them much more. I don't know enough to get to the bottom of it. I've, read a number of pieces on it, but can't know for sure. But I would just tell you that that argument is out there. Have you heard that argument?
Yes, this is what mainly came from the Russian side in the early stages of that war, that they had offered certain things, but it wasn't the things that the Iranians were looking for. And the Iranians were also a little bit disappointed in the early statements that came out. As you recall, the BRICS group did not at first condemn the Israelis. This was mostly because of what the Indians were doing within the BRICS. Eventually, they changed, and BRICS came out and SCO came out with strong statements on this matter. But I think in general, the Iranians were a little bit disappointed, particularly mindful of the fact that the help the Iranians have provided the Russians in Ukraine and the very high cost they have paid, particularly in their relationship with Europe for having done so. But on your larger point, you're absolutely right. The Iranians have had a very lengthy, problematic relationship with the Russians, and as a result, are very wary of putting themselves in a situation in which they would be too dependent on the Russians. At the end of the day, the Russians and the Chinese both sent Iran to the UN Security Council in 2006. That paved the way for all of the UN sanctions on Iran's nuclear program. In 1995, there was a bit of a warming of ties between Iran and Russia, and the Iranian foreign minister at the time said that Russian-Iranian relations have never been better in 500 years, and he was not exaggerating. That tells you about the depth of animosity that has existed between the two countries.
Yeah, and with regard to the other question, I think the Chinese and the Russians have both condemned the genocide very gently. I am deeply disappointed that both countries have not been standing on the rooftops condemning the genocide, but they have not. I think in the Chinese case, which is what your question is about, I think the Chinese don't want to get too far out in front because they don't want to antagonize the Americans and they don't want to antagonize the Europeans. You want to remember that the Europeans and the Americans are complicit in this genocide. Just very important to understand that. They don't want to be told that it's a genocide. They don't want to be reminded that they're complicit in this genocide. So the Chinese have, spoken softly in their criticism. And I, again, think this is terribly unfortunate.
We've talked about inaction, but I'm just wondering about, the Chinese role in sort of brokering a détente between Saudi Arabia and Iran a couple of years ago. Do you see that kind of a role taking place, sort of trying to broker some of these relations positively?
Who do you want to answer that?
Well, with you, Professor Mearsheimer, and then Trita.
Okay. Oh, I think that the more time goes on, the more of that you're going to see. I think what you want to understand is that the Chinese are interested in imitating the United States. They are interested in being a global superpower. Just think about Belt and Road. Belt and Road is all about expanding Chinese economic and political influence all around the planet. It's exactly what the Americans did as the United States became more and more powerful. And it's completely understandable that the Chinese are doing this. And from a Chinese point of view, it makes eminently good sense. But as you know, whenever you start spreading your economic and political influence around the planet, it's not long before the Chinese military is going to follow to protect those interests. And this is why I was saying the Chinese are building a blue water navy, and they're interested in protecting their sea lines of communication into the Persian Gulf area, where they get a lot of oil. And therefore, they're going to have much more influence or increasing influence moving forward. And as they have increasing military, political, and economic influence in the Gulf, you surely will see them throwing their weight around. Sometimes that will be for the good and sometimes not. But I think that one would expect in the future to see them doing things like trying to negotiate better relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia.
Interesting. Trita, how would you respond?
Yes, I mean, as John said, when the Chinese have found opportunities to be helpful, they have done so. They've also gone to great lengths to try to show that they're not using this diplomacy to isolate the United States. This is not something they're done to score points against the US. This is also part of the reason why they're not throwing themselves into the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. A combination of lack of expertise, and no ripeness in resolving the conflict, so they don't want to go in and fail, but also because they know how deeply involved the US is, and any Chinese involvement in that would be very negatively viewed by the United States. But I think you are going to see that countries have higher and higher expectations for the Chinese to play some sort of a role, because up until recently, at least, and by and large still, they're just going in there trying to maximize their trade, making sure that they have positive relations with all of the different actors, and to the extent possible, stay out of the region's internal quarrels. They can have great relations with Israel and with Iran and still master the ability of not getting involved in their internal quarrels. We have quite the opposite talent. We cannot help ourselves getting involved in everyone else's fights.
Which, by the way, Trita, works to China's advantage. Because
Certainly.
China should hope that we remain deeply engaged in the Middle East. They should hope we get involved in another war in Iran where we expend all our ammunition and all these expensive weapons that we would otherwise use against them in East Asia. They should hope we remain pinned down in Ukraine.
I remember I had a conversation with a Chinese diplomat. I think this must have been 2005 or so, about the situation in Iraq. And at some point, I just had to tell them, but come on, admit it. You're quite happy to see the United States shoot itself in the foot with this invasion and just getting dragged into this self-created quagmires. And he looked at me and he said, our problem is that America is declining faster than China can rise. That hurt.
Wow. Ouch. Wow, that's interesting. And gentlemen, we would love to carry on this conversation, but we are very mindful of your time and everybody who joined us today. We really wish we could have had more time for questions. But again, as Roxanne said, just your conversation with each other was just amazing for us all to listen and learn from. Trita and Professor John Mearsheimer, thank you both so much for your incisive analysis and for guiding us through these really critical dynamics. Your expertise has not only deepened our understanding, but has really equipped us to navigate these incredibly turbulent times with greater clarity. So we can't thank you enough for your time. To our very engaged audience, thank you so much for being here. Your presence today reflects a real commitment to grappling with these issues. We had a wonderful turnout, and we really urge you to carry this momentum forward, continue to advocate, educate, and hold power to account. And until we meet again, please stay involved and stay in touch.
Thank you for having me on the show. I enjoyed it thoroughly.
Thank you. Likewise. Thank you so much.
Thank you all
Good to
so
see you again,
much.
John.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Good night, everyone.